We read last week's reading how Yaakov had taken the birthright and the blessings which were rightfully his. However, Esau felt that since he was denied the birthright, he vowed to kill Yaakov. And he was instructed by his mother to flee to her brother's community, which was Haran, which was outside of Israel, and until his brother's anger is somehow diffused, till he forgets what happened, and he should go there for a short stay. And the words that she said was Liyom Machadim, for a short period of time. Factually, he stayed away for 36 years. From the time he left till he returned, it was 36 years later, his mother was no longer alive. Rivka, his mother, who he was so close with, passed away. And because he denied his parents the mitzvah of honoring a father and mother, measure for measure, he was denied respect and the relationship with Yosef for 22 years. Yosef was the apple of Yaakov's eye. He believed that he was his successor, which he was his successor. He oversaw the Jewish community in exile. He was the provider. For 22 years, Yaakov believed that he was not alive. Only after 22 years later did he inform his father that he is alive, and that's when Yaakov came to Egypt and spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt. Measure for measure. You denied your parents respect, this honoring them for 22 years. The most special of your children, who's the equivalent of all your children, you'll be denied that relationship for 22 years, okay? However, he was away for 36 years. So why isn't he accountable for the additional 14 years? And what were those additional 14 years? So the Midrash tells us that before he fled to Haran, to the community of his uncle, his mother's brother, who was no straight shooter, as they would say. He was a conniving, deceptive. He spoke out of 9 sides of his mouth simultaneously. He cheated Yaakov endless times over, which we will discuss. Haran was a community that was rife with adultery, murder, idolatry. Yaakov felt he has to spend 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver to study Torah for 14 years before he goes there. So because those 14 years were for the sake of the study of Torah, which was necessary, the merit of the Torah protected him that he was only denied Yosef 22 years, not 36 years. Although he was away for 36 years. So this obvious question, Yaakov is quantified by the Torah as Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Oholim. He's the perfect person who dwells in the tent of Torah. So if he studied Torah until he was 63 years old, you could study Torah forever. Why was that Torah sufficient for the departure moment? Why do you have to go and spend an additional 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver to study from Aver an additional 14 years before he departed from Israel to go to this forsaken place, his uncle's community? Why? Now, the Torah tells us when he came back on his way, it says, Vayishka v'mokamahu. On the Temple Mount, when he had the prophetic vision, it says he slept at that location. What's the inference? And whenever you sleep, you usually sleep in the supine position. You're not sitting up. So what does the Torah tell him? He slept at that location. So Rashi cites the Midrash. The 14 years he spent in Shem Aver studying Torah, he never lied down, never slept in a bed. He was so fully invested in that Torah, he did not allow himself a moment leisure to lie down in bed or to lie in a horizontal position, always sitting up. But again, ask the question. All the years that he had studied before that moment, he never lied down. But the intensity of this study for those 14 years, he invested every fiber of his being in that Torah study. So evidently, this Torah study was different than the Torah study that he invested his life in all the years. Different. What's the difference? Until the incident of taking the birthright, Yaakov never believed, ever, he'd have to leave the Holy Land. He literally was born into the Holy of Holies, his parents' home, matriarch, studied continuously without any distraction. And all of a sudden now he comes to realization and he's instructed by his mother through prophetic design, he must leave the land. The impurity of outside of Israel, the impurity of his uncle's community, he never prepared himself for that kind of onslaught, for that level of exposure, never. As a result of that, for the sake of spiritually fortifying himself, he has to go study from Aver. Who is Aver? Aver is the son of Shem, who is the son of Noach. These people lived pre-flood. They witnessed, experienced, and understood evil at its most extreme level. What kind of Torah do you need to combat that kind of evil? Aver knew exactly. When you go to war, you have to go with weaponry. The weaponry has to be at a level to be able to fight the battle. If you have some kind of archaic weaponry, you can't fight it, sophisticated weapons with archaic weaponry. Here, he needed a different kind of weaponry to be able to deal with all the issues of whatever Lavan represented. And that's not something he even counted of ever experiencing. He knew his father never left the confines of Israel, of Canaan. He believed he wouldn't have to. But his father was different than he was. His father could not leave the confines of Israel because his father was an unblemished offering, was a consecrated offering. And as you cannot take an offering outside the confines of the temple, Yitzhak was not permitted to leave the confines, the border of Israel. Yaakov is not the unblemished offering, but he believed it's something similar. So he never prepared for that. Now that he realizes that he has to confront all these issues of outside of Israel, and even to a greater degree, Lavan's community, Haran, which is rife, as I said, with the three cardinal sins, which is the daily fare of behavior there, he really has to prepare himself. Otherwise, he'll be compromised, God forbid, and his spiritual standing will actually be undermined. Therefore, as a result of that, he was not accountable for the 14 years that he spent prior to go. It was only 22 years that he was away. And that was in violation of the permission his mother had given him, or the instruction, Yom HaChodim. You go for a short time. He overstayed that period. Therefore, he paid in spades, as they say. He paid by being convinced that his son was not alive. The apple of his eye, Yosef, who was in every sense of the word, had his capability, is no longer there. Okay? Is no longer alive. Why did Yaakov stay 22 years in Haran? And Rashi cites the Midrash. When Eliezer, the slave of Avram, went to negotiate the hand of Rivka, Avram understood these kinds of people backwards and forwards, inside out. Every level of the equation he understood. This was his family. And he came from there initially. He came from Haran. And he understood, unless you go with great wealth, there's no way you're going to negotiate the hand of Rivka. And therefore, he had signed over all his possessions to Yitzchak, and Eliezer was Yitzchak's representative to negotiate a hand in marriage. Besuel and Lavan were evil people. And he understood, if you're actually caught in their clutches, you'll never creep out of there. You'll be entombed there. You'll be compromised. So if Eliezer, the slave, one with such wealth, you don't think Rivka and Yitzchak had given Yaakov that same level of wealth to negotiate the hand of whoever that wife will be and leave soon after he negotiates it? But yet, he had to work 7 hard years for Rachel and another 7 hard years for Leah, 14 years. And then he had to work an additional 6 years just to create wealth for his family. But if Yaakov was given all this wealth, he should have been in and out, as Eliezer was in and out. Negotiate, they see what you have, and leave. But he was imprisoned there, so to say, incarcerated for 20 years. And then, because he had all this wealth, it took him 2 years to travel back. That's how we come up with number 22. What happened to the wealth? Well, there's no question he was given that wealth, because Yitzchak had that wealth to give him. So the Midrash tells us, Esav had a son by the name of Eliphaz. Eliphaz was instructed by his father when he realized that he had fled to Haran, Yaakov, he should pursue him and kill him. Well, that's his agent. Eliphaz is his father's agent to take Yaakov's life for what he had done, for stealing the birthright. Eliphaz comes to Yaakov and he says, I must kill you. So Yaakov says, why? Because there's a mitzvah of honoring the father, and I'm bound to the wishes of my father. So if my father says, you must kill me, I must kill you, I have to kill you. There's no two ways about it. So Yaakov says to Eliphaz, but you studied under the tutelage of your grandfather, and he taught you the principle that oni choshev kemes, that if a person is impoverished, you're like a dead man. Who looks at a poor man? You have no significance, you have no value. Since for all intents and purposes, when you take my wealth, it's the equivalent of taking my life. Take my wealth, and as a result of that, I remain alive, and you fulfill the mitzvah of your father by reducing me to a non-value, which is equivalent of dead man. Eliphaz says, that makes good sense. He takes his wealth, goes back home. We'll discuss in a moment. When he came back to his father, to Esav, so Esav says, so how was it? And he's come back with tremendous wealth. He says, factually, I didn't kill him. I wanted to, but he convinced me not to because an impoverished person is like a dead person. When Esav heard this, do you think it sat well with him? He probably took his son and he gave a good shellacking, as they used to say, and said, what's this all about? I told you to kill him. Or he give me a halachic type of concept that a poor man's like a dead man. I want him in a coffin in the ground. I don't want anything but that. But evidently he didn't. He did not react to him. What's proof in the pudding and back to him? Of course, Esav knew exactly where he was located. He was in the home of Lavan. Esav could have gone there and killed him, but he didn't. Why did he not go and kill him? So evidently it was sufficient to take his wealth, and that will bring about what has to be brought about. The end result, which we'll discuss. But let's talk about why did Yaakov was stuck in Haran for 22 years because he gave up his wealth to Eliphaz. That's the only reason. He had to work 14 years for his 2 wives. Then he had to work another 6 years for wealth. We have a principle in Judaism, in Torah, it's called the laws of self-defense. Habola horcho, hashkem v'horgo. If a man comes to kill you, you preempt him and you kill him. That's called the laws of self-defense. Yaakov, why did he forfeit his wealth? And he understood what it was going to cost him. He's going to be literally stuck there for an extended period of time. He knows Lavan is not giving his daughter to work for a month or 6 months. It's going to be a long haul, a long stay. But if he could have killed Eliphaz and retained his money and negotiated his hand, he would have been out there and he would have been able to fulfill the prerequisite of his mother, go for a short stay. But because he gave up his wealth, he relinquished it, therefore he was caught in this problem. It was no longer, he couldn't fulfill the obligation of Yom HaChodim, and he stayed there for 22 years. And Yaakov knew he'd have to pay the price. But why pay the price if you could have killed Eliphaz based on the principle that if somebody attempts to kill you, you should preempt him and kill him? That's the question I asked. So what would you say? You'll say that maybe Yaakov didn't have the ability to kill Eliphaz. Eliphaz was so overwhelmingly stronger than he was, he couldn't kill him. So what? You could talk self-defense from today forever. But if the only way I can buy my life is by giving my wealth, he had no other alternative. But how do we know that Yaakov could have killed him? Yaakov was strong enough, he was able to kill Eliphaz. Where do we know this from? So I said, where we know it from is that we find that when Yaakov finally came to Haran, Lavan had no sons. Who was the shepherdess? The shepherdess was Rachel. She was the shepherdess. And in those days, that the water should not evaporate from the sun, they'd have a boulder on the mouth of the well, and they'd wait for a few flocks to gather around the well, and the shepherds jointly, they would roll off this very big boulder. So what happened? He comes and he sees these 3 shepherds waiting with the flocks, and the boulder's on the well, and it's a hot day. And he says to them, why are you sitting around doing nothing? You people are, your employees. You're employed by your employer. They said, because we're waiting here to have enough people to be able to roll the stone off the mouth of the well. Therefore, we have no choice. Okay? That's what they said to him. All of a sudden, the Torah tells us, Yaakov sees Rachel coming. And Rachel came. As I said, Lavan had no sons. So who are his shepherds or shepherdesses? His daughters. He sees Rachel and he understands immediately that this is his destined wife. This is the niece of his mother. And he realizes her flock has to be watered. He goes and he plucks the boulder off the mouth of the well. Literally, not roll it off, he plucked it off. So Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, from here we see that Yaakov's power was enormous. He had enormous physical strength. That he was able to pluck the boulder off the mouth of the well, the way one takes a cork off out of a bottle, without level of ease. He had tremendous strength. So I asked the question, why is that important for us to know? He did have a tremendous strength. He didn't have a tremendous strength. Why is that important for us to know? Torah has to tell us that he plucked the boulder off the well. So what we had said in the past was the Torah is sharing this information with us to inform us he had sufficient strength that he could have killed Eliphaz. He could have killed Eliphaz. So if he could have killed Eliphaz, why did he kill Eliphaz? Based on the laws of self-defense, a person who attempts to kill you, you should preempt him, kill him. Why did Yaakov kill Eliphaz, retain his wealth? He would have negotiated the hands of his wife and not be stuck there for 20 years, which he was. And for that, he had to pay the price of being separated from Yosef for 22 years. It's an obvious, simple question. Yaakov himself at Mount Moriah, the Torah tells us he took 12 stones and he put them, he took stones, doesn't say how many stones, and he put the stones around his head as a protection. And when he awoke, he says he took this stone. And while he was sleeping, he had a prophecy, which we'll discuss in a moment. And when he woke, the multiple stones were fused together as one stone. What is the Torah telling us? So Rashi cites the Midrash that each stone said to the other stone, I want the tzaddik, his head should rest on me, not on the other stone. So how does Hashem make peace between the stones? He fuses them together. That's the Midrash Rashi cites. So firstly, what do you mean the stones are fighting? Stones are inanimate. So we discussed many times, anything in the physical has a spiritual counterpart, which actually is responsible for the energies that are released to allow the stone to manifest itself as a material stone. That's what it is. So when we say they were fighting among themselves, not with the physical stones, talking to the deities that are behind the stone, they were fighting among themselves. And each one said, let the tzaddik place his head upon me. How does Hashem bring peace among them all? He fuses them all together into one stone. That's the Midrash Rashi says, explains. However, the Midrash says more than that. Yaakov Avinu took 12 stones. And why did he take 12 stones? Because he knew there was a tradition passed down among the Avos HaKadoshim, the holy patriarchs, that ultimately the Jewish people would be 12 tribes. 12 tribes. And the question was he the patriarch who was sufficiently perfected to be the father of the 12 tribes? His father was not. His grandfather was not. Maybe he has some impurity within his seed, and therefore it's his son will be the ultimate patriarch, but he himself, it's too early. Or maybe it's not too early. So when the stones were fused into one stone, that meant that they have that worthiness. That was, so the 12 stones being fused into one means he will be the final patriarch of the Jewish people. He will father the Shiftei Kod, the tribes of God. And therefore we find, as soon as he was informed of this, he was like walking on air. It says, Vayisa Raglov Yelech. His feet carried him and he walked. I mean, every person walks with his feet. It says Vayisa. He was elevated. He was ecstatic. He was that he was the one who was going to father the 12 tribes, which addresses the objective of creation. That was the excitement. He was literally enthralled with this. Okay? That's the understanding. Yaakov himself didn't just, purity doesn't come out of a vacuum. He spent all those years studying Torah. He spent those intense years in Shem Ve'ever studying 14 years. That means he was only married when he arrived at Lavan at the age of 77. He's no youngster. So if he's no youngster and he achieved this level of purity that he's qualified to father Jewish people, why does he have to take a chance and remain literally incarcerated in that society where, as it says, the 3 cardinal sins is fair in the day, where he could have negotiated the hand of Rachel and Leah with Lavan and been out of there. But as a result of this, he was there for 20 years, working for his wives, for his wealth. Why? And we know he could have killed him because the Torah reveals to us the fact that he pulled the boulder off the well. So that's how we know he had that enormous strength that he could have. Why did he not? So we had said in the past, very important fundamental, that we have a principle, Adam Nifel Kfi Polosov, that we all are products of our behavior. Whatever we do, there is an effect. Now, We know a person goes to war, and war means killing. War means if you have to kill, you kill. When a person takes a life, or multiple lives, and now he's come back from the battlefield, does he have the same sensitivities to life post as pre? The answer is definitely not. A person has to resort to certain things. He has no choice. But even though it's justified, but in terms of you as a person, you're no longer the same person because you're a person who took a life. Being a person who took a life, you've been diminished, spiritually diminished. Yaakov understood that if he's diminished, his children, who are the Shiftei Kah, are the future tribes that through them God's glory is coming about, are going to be at a lesser level. It's worthwhile for him to not to compromise his spirituality. Give away all the wealth, and he'll deal with the 20 years in the home of Lavan, regardless of the price that he has to pay. But at least his children that are going to be born are going to be born of that special caliber, the holiness of not being diminished, the holiness of himself. Therefore, it was worthwhile to give away the wealth. Although 20 years, he's going to deny his parents, honoring his parents, and he's going to pay for it, doesn't make a difference. He's agreeable to pay for it. Understanding the value of diminishment. Once mentioned the name of the Maharal of Prague, of the Rabbi Luzzatto, in one of his works, that a person, in terms of his levels of accomplishment, could be in the world to come a leader. But because in the physical life, the person wants some degrees of comfort and amenities, so as a result of that, and he prays for it, providing those amenities in this world, sometimes, not always, is actually a withdrawal of the account. And once you withdraw from that spiritual account, your position in the world to come becomes lessened. You're no longer a leader, you become a follower. If he wouldn't have benefited from this world, from his actions, and it would have been withdrawn, he would have been a leader in the world to come. But because he had drawn from his spiritual bank account, now he comes in at a lesser level. He's not there any longer. Yaakov wanted nothing from this world. Nothing. But nevertheless, you never know. It wasn't worth it for Yaakov. If he would kill Esav, he'd be diminished. We have later, next week's reading, when he confronted Esav, it says he was pained for two reasons. He was pained that he may be killed, and he was pained even if he kills his brother. Why killed if you kill your brother? The man's evil. Because killing means diminishment. Yaakov did not want to be diminished under any circumstance. There's a Ramban in this week's Parsha, very fundamental Ramban. Ramban writes, when he had the prophetic vision, he saw the ladder, the top of the ladder reached to heaven, the sky, and the base of the ladder was on the ground. God stands on top of the ladder and speaks to him. What is the significance of standing on top of the ladder? So the Ramban writes in his commentary, "Ve'reu ki yizborach nitzav ala sulam umavtichu liYaakov v'avtochu gdola." God is standing on top of the ladder, Kaviyochol, and he's promising him a great promise, a great guarantee. Lo hodia shehu lo yeh biyad hamalochim. To inform him, he's no longer under the protection of angels. Avli yechelek Hashem V'yeh imo tamid. From now on going forward, he is part of God's portion, and God will not detach himself from him. Okay? Kol she'omar v'hinei anochi imoch. As Hashem said in the prophetic dream, I am with you, ushmarticha b'chol asher telech, and I will watch over you wherever you go. Ki malosa gedolo b'shat tzadikim. The spiritual level of Yaakov was greater than other tzaddikim. Shenema b'hem. David Mel says regarding other tzaddikim, ki malocha v'yitzav loch lishmorcha b'chol d'rachecha. God will give the order to the malachim, to the angels, to protect you in all your ways, in all your endeavors. Yaakov did not have to need angels to protect him. He was at such a spiritual level, God says, you with me. When you're with God, you need no angels any longer. That was Yaakov's dimension. But this was, he was informed now when he had the prophetic dream on Har Moriah. Now, the Midrash tells us that why is it so important to do a mitzvah, besides the obligation? So the Midrash tells us Omer Meir. Also, Adam mitzvah achas. Meir says, a person does one mitzvah, Mosu malach echod. They give you an angel. The mitzvah creates an angel to give you that angel. Also, shtei mitzvos. Person does two mitzvos. Mosu lo shnei malachim. They give the person two angels, one for each mitzvah. Also, mitzvahs harbe. He does multiple mitzvos. Mosu lo malachim harbe. They give him many malachim. Shenemar, as it says in Tehillim, ki malocha vitzava loch lishmorcha. God will give malachim and command them to watch over you. V'lama, why does he need malachim to watch over him? Kedei l'sham min hamazikin, to protect him from the damaging forces out there, the nether forces. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Yipol b'tzidcha elef. From your right side, 1,000 will fall down. The enemy. Umahu Yipol. What does it mean? Yipol. Mashlimim lo. Kin yishnemar. Meaning they'll make peace with you. Uravova miminecha, and 10,000 from your right side. We're speaking regarding Yaakov, he needed malachim. But according to what we say, until when did he need malachim? Until the event of Har Moriah, he needed malach. According to Ramban, he needed angels to protect him because he wasn't there yet. When did he achieve this status? Anochi imach ushmarticha. I am with you, and there I will watch over you. It's only this moment going forward. At this level, he needs no malachim to protect him. Because if you're with God, you have all the protection in the world. Everything else would be totally dismissed. So when did Yaakov become the Merkava? We say each one of the patriarchs was the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. At this moment, Har Moriah, Yaakov became the Merkava. God, according to Ramban, God says, I am always with you. I will never detach myself from you. If that is the case, you have the ultimate protection. We had mentioned in the past the name of the Maharal of Prague. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Atem hadvekim Hashem Elokeichem chaim kulchem hayom. You cleave to God, you live continuously. So the Maharal of Prague explains, what is the source of all blessing? What's the source of all life? God. So therefore, the more you securely attach to God, the greater relevance you have to bracha and to life. That's atem adveikim Hashem elkechem. When you cleave to God, your Lord, chaim kulchem hayom. You will live forever. So over here, so until this moment, he needed protection. What was the protection? The Malachim. This moment going forward, when he became the Merkava, he needs no angels to protect him. So ki malach v'yitzavaloch lishmocho b'chol d'rachecha, that's only pre this moment, not post this moment. What does he tell him? Your children will be like the dust of the earth, and they will expand in all directions. West, east, north, south. Okay? We find by Avram and Yitzchak, your children will be kechol hayam, like the sand on the beaches, like the stars in the heaven. To say something, your children be like the dust of the earth. What is the connotation of dust? It's a negative connotation. So what does it mean? But why is this the ultimate bracha? This is the ultimate bracha. Now, how does one make mortar? How does one make mortar? You take the dust of the earth, you mix it with water, and that's how you make cement. So Hashem says to Yaakov, your children have the characteristic of dust. What is the characteristic of dust? If you add water, it becomes substance. If you don't have water added to it, what happens? When the wind comes, it gets scattered in every direction, the dust. We know that the Gemara cites many verses, psukim, that the Torah is compared to water. As water is essential for life, identically the Torah is essential for the spiritual life of a Jew. So there are many parallels between water, H2O, and Torah study. And there are other references to this. The Mayim, Torah and Mayim are synonymous. If you take water and you add it to dust, it means you take Torah and you intermingle it with your being. Then you become substantial. When the winds blow, you're not scattered. You're secure in your place. What happens if you don't have the Torah, which is the equivalent of the water, intermingled in your being? What happens when the wind starts blowing? What happens is that dust is going to be scattered in every direction. But that exactly is the characteristic of the Jew. Either we're way up there because we're anchored. And what anchors us? The Torah, because that gives us substance and value. But if you don't have the Torah, what are you worth? It's irrelevant what Wall Street says you're worth or what somebody else says you're worth. But innate value, what are you worth? Therefore, the bracha kafar oretz, although it seems to be demeaning, but as demeaning as it is, but since it's unlimited, the dust of the earth, when you add Torah, then it becomes a different reality of life. That's v'hoyasarcha kafar oretz. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, Medrash, is very interesting interpretation. When you have an invading army, there's a Medrash. The Medrash says, quotes a pasuk that the Jewish people are referred to as Even Yisrael. We are the stone, the boulder of Israel. Why are we compared to the boulder? So the Medrash tells us that in the medieval times, they would have these contests, these people who had tremendous, enormous strength. They were called he-men, like Atlas. They would lift the boulder above their heads. And if you'd be able to lift the boulder above your heads, you'd win a purse of gold. So there's this tremendous boulder in the town square. And for centuries, people have been attempting to lift the boulder, but the issue with a boulder is that if you lift the boulder up to a certain point and you have it above yourself and you should actually lose your footing, you get crushed under the boulder. The boulder that you attempt to tackle, that boulder will destroy you. So the Midrash says, if you go through the dustbins of history, many civilizations try to tackle with the Jew, try to destroy the Jewish people. We were like the boulder. They engaged with us, they attempted to annihilate us, but who was annihilated? Our oppressors were the ones who actually ultimately were destroyed. They no longer exist for whatever reason, but they no longer exist. So therefore, that's the reason why the Jewish people are called Eved Yisrael. We're the boulder of Israel. Rather than the boulder being tackled, the boulder destroys the one who tried to tackle him. Every nation that attempted to tackle us, to harm us, to annihilate us, ultimately, those nations no longer exist. They're in the dustbins of history. That's why it's called Eved Yisrael. So the Midrash tells us here that when you have an invading army coming in to a country, and they're wearing dress uniforms, and as they walk, they march. What do you think those dress uniforms are going to look like? They're going to be coated with dust, because as they march in and they trample on the ground, the dust rises and covers them. That's identically what's going to happen. Any nation that attempted to conquer the Jewish people, they trampled on us. But what happened when they trampled on us? The dust engulfed them, and through that engulfment, they were destroyed. So through the Jewish people, they were destroyed. That's how it happened. That's kafar oretz. The Jew has that characteristics of afar, of dust, because when you walk on it, not only do you get your shoes full of dust, but your clothing get full of dust. And it becomes intermingled in your life. That's the bracha, vayusarcha kafar oretz. And that's why it says, ufaratzta, you'll spread Yoma, V'kedma, south, east. Zafon v'negbo. God says, I am with you, I will watch over you. Now, what is ushmarticho? Ushmarticho. So the Medrash says, I will watch over you from adultery, idolatry, and murder. That you will not be vulnerable to any of these things. You will not become an adulterer. You will not become, God forbid, a murderer, and you will not become an idolater, a pagan. You'll have special divine protection. But the Medrash is not finished. And you will not speak Lashon Hara. I will protect you, you shouldn't speak Lashon Hara. So the obvious question is, if God's providing protection for the most extreme level of transgressions, I mean, how does Lashon Hara somehow have any relevance to verse 3? It's seemingly minuscule, minor, compared to verse 3. No. God says, I watch you over A, B, C, even D, which is Lashon Hara, speaking negatively about your fellow. How do we understand it? So what I said in the past, a human being understands the value of another human being to some level. So how do you take another life? How does a person take another life? How does a person, God forbid, commit adultery with someone else's wife? How? I mean, in good conscience. I mean, how do you look yourself in the mirror? How do you deal with your own conscience, crossing certain lines which are unconscionable when you cross them? So there's a psychological approach which makes it a lot easier, that there's less guilt. It's like when a person commits murder, God forbid, and the person himself had very little worth, financial worth, or he himself doesn't contribute to the gross national product. He's a ward of the country, and everybody's underwriting him. Plus, he doesn't contribute anything. that person is easier to eliminate than a person who's a contributor to society. Because the person has been so minimized in his eyes, what did I do so terrible? You don't see that person in the context of that human being. So because you've minimized him and you've diminished him through whatever approach, therefore it becomes more palatable. If you have to kill, you will kill him. His wife, what is she married to? To this? The man barely earns a living. He's not worthy of having such a wife. If his wife would have known, she wouldn't have ever married him. There, as a result of that, a person justifies, God forbid, adultery. Same approach. Idolatry, it's very attractive. It draws one. But you know, when you speak Lashon Hara, how does one minimize another person? You know, as they say, you know, you hear enough negativity about a person, you begin believing it after a while. And you can't get it out of your mind, out of your emotion, out of your evaluation. You heard he's a thief. He's a no good person. He's unethical and he's immoral. He has such things. So how do you see that person? He doesn't have much worth. So when Yaakov prayed, Ushmarticha, and God says, I will watch over you. What does watching over mean? Not to become the murderer. But how's it possible? Not become the idolater, because when the person will take that life, he's not going to see it as murder, but rather as a service to humanity that that person was taken out. Rather than as a detriment to society, it's a service to society. Rather than seeing it as adultery, he will not fully internalize the severity of his action, because he says, she's not even the wife to that man. He's not worthy of having such a wife. They went through motions, that's about it. Therefore, he could commit adultery. So where does it all begin? It doesn't begin with murder, adultery. It all begins with minimizing a person and putting it in a mindset, a framework that it is tolerable or even encouraged. And there's nothing wrong with it. That's the issue. Therefore, when Yaakov prayed for protection, it's not only from the most serious transgressions, even what seems to be minor, but that minor transgression ultimately will bring one closer to the three cardinal sins. And Yaakov understood this. Therefore, he prayed for this level of divine protection, even from something which seems to be so minor and not major. I think we'll stop here today.